The massive rifle bucked against her shoulder, a deafening roar that silenced the desert. For 7.5 seconds, the world held its breath. A cocky SEAL commander was about to learn a lesson he would never forget, and a ghost from the past was about to be reborn. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Nevada desert was a furnace, a sprawling, state-of-the-art military firing range shimmering under a merciless sun. The air, thick with heat and the smell of scorched earth and cordite, vibrated with the sharp, whip-crack reports of advanced rifles. Here, the nation's most elite warfighters, Navy SEALs from a Tier 1 team, were putting the next generation of sniper systems through their paces. The atmosphere was a potent cocktail of testosterone, bravado, and technology worth more than a small town's annual budget. Sleek, carbon fiber rifles with network scopes and integrated ballistic computers spat rounds with brutal efficiency. Off to the side, away from the main cluster of operators, a woman worked in quiet solitude. Hannah Cross was a civilian, a weapons technician in her early 30s, though the focused intensity in her eyes made her seem older. She was dressed for function, not fashion, in practical, faded cargo pants and a nondescript gray shirt that did little to hide the lean, wiry strength in her arms. Her movements were a study in precision, economical, and utterly devoid of wasted effort. She was meticulously cleaning and tuning a rifle that, in this company, looked like a forgotten relic. It was a Barrett M82A1A, 50 caliber behemoth, its metal scarred and worn from campaigns and conflicts that predated the careers of the men laughing nearby. She handled the weapon with a loving, almost reverent touch. Her fingers, slender but strong, traced the worn contours of the receiver, feeling for imperfections the way a sculptor feels for the soul of a stone. With a specialized tool, she made a minute adjustment to the trigger assembly. Her head tilted as she listened for a click so faint it was lost to the cacophony of the range. To anyone watching, she was just a mechanic tinkering with an old piece of hardware. But in her hands, the 29-pound rifle felt as balanced and familiar as a limb. It was more than a machine to her. It was an extension of a will she kept carefully buried. Commander Thorne noticed her. It was impossible not to. He was the picture of a modern special operator, tall and broad-shouldered, his physique a testament to a life of relentless physical conditioning. He moved with an air of absolute confidence that often bled into outright arrogance. A perpetual smirk seemed etched onto his face as he observed his men, their easy successes, with the new rifles confirming his own belief in their, and his, superiority. His gaze swept past the high-tech gear and landed on the anachronism at the quiet workbench. He strode over, his boots crunching on the gravel, the laughter of his team trailing off as they turned to watch the unfolding entertainment. He loomed over Hannah's workspace, casting a long shadow that fell across the scarred metal of the Barrett. "What's that you got there, sweetheart?" he boomed, his voice pitched for his audience. "Taking the museum out for a stroll?" Hannah didn't look up. Her focus was absolute. She was seating a massive 50 caliber round into the magazine, her thumb pressing it down until it clicked into place with a sound of perfect, final authority. Only then, after finishing the task, did she slowly raise her eyes. Her gaze was calm, a placid, neutral gray that betrayed nothing. It was the gaze of someone who had seen too much to be easily impressed or intimidated. "Just running some diagnostics, Commander," she said, her voice even and low, a stark contrast to his performative volume. Thorne chuckled, a throaty, dismissive sound. He gestured with a thumb toward the Barrett, the smirk widening on his face. "Diagnostics? That thing belongs in a VFW hall, not on a live-fire range. You're better off with a paintball gun." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for his men to hear. "Don't hurt yourself playing with the antiques." His team snickered on cue. The sound grated on the desert air. Hannah's expression remained a placid mask, but a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening in her jaw marked the insult's landing. She offered no retort, no defense of her work or her weapon. She simply gave a short, non-committal nod, a gesture of dismissal disguised as acquiescence, and returned her focus to the rifle. Her attention was back on the worn metal, the glint of the sun on the high-tech scopes of the SEAL's rifles a world away from the dull, matte finish of her supposed antique. The injustice of his mockery hung in the shimmering heat, a question mark in the air, answered only by the quiet competence of her hands. The main firing line was a showcase of 21st-century warfare. The SEALs, now prone behind their futuristic rifles, engaged targets at 1,500 and 2,000 meters. Their results were impressive, but expected. Each successful hit was registered on digital displays, a neat, clean validation of the millions of dollars invested in their equipment. They were expert marksmen using expert tools. Then, a new voice crackled over the range-wide comm system, a range officer announcing a change in the day's schedule. "All right, gentlemen, listen up. We're running a cold bore challenge, a new long-range verification for the base's tracking systems. A steel silhouette target, a stark, man-shaped slab of AR-500 steel, as being positioned by a remote-controlled vehicle. But this target wasn't at 2,000 meters. It was being placed at a staggering, almost laughable distance. 3,400 meters, over 2 miles away. It was far beyond the effective range of any conventional system being tested, a distance where the bullet's flight time would be measured in many long seconds, and a dozen environmental factors could push it yards off course. The challenge was less a test of marksmanship and more a technical demonstration for the range's advanced tracking cameras and atmospheric sensors. The SEALs began to talk amongst themselves, their tones a mixture of academic interest and casual dismissal. They discussed windage, the planet's rotation influencing the bullet's path through the Coriolis effect, changes in air density, and the subtle droop of the bullet's trajectory over such an extreme distance. It was a theoretical problem, a mathematician's puzzle, not a shooter's task. Commander Thorne scoffed, shaking his head. "Waste of ammo," he declared to no one in particular. "Might as well just throw the damn bullet." While they debated the physics of the impossible, Hannah Cross acted. With an unhurried purpose that seemed to bend the frantic energy of the range around her, she calmly lifted the heavy Barrett from her workbench. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't seek approval. She simply moved. Her steps measured and deliberate as she carried the big rifle to an open firing station at the end of the line. A few of the range officers, men who had seen thousands of shooters come and go, paused their own conversations to watch her. There was something in her economy of motion, a deep, ingrained confidence that separated her from the swagger of the operators. She unfolded the bipod, the steel legs clicking into place with crisp precision, and settled the heavy rifle onto the shooting mat. The weapon looked immense, a piece of artillery compared to the sleek rifles of the SEALs. From a pouch on her belt, she produced a small, custom-built device, a miniature weather station no bigger than a deck of cards, and attached it to a port on a ruggedized tablet strapped to her wrist. Data began to stream instantly, a cascade of numbers detailing wind speed, direction, humidity, barometric pressure, and temperature. She wasn't just a technician, she was a scientist preparing an experiment. The tension on the range began to shift. It was a subtle change, a quietening of the ambient chatter, as more and more eyes turned toward the lone woman and her antiquated cannon. The SEAL's casual, theoretical discussion of the shot stood in stark contrast to Hannah's focused, practical preparation. A palpable sense of anticipation began to build, thick and heavy as the desert heat. What did this quiet woman know that the world's most elite soldiers did not? All eyes, both naked and behind powerful optics, strained to see the target. A tiny, insignificant speck of steel, shimmering in the distance, a metal ghost that was all but invisible against the brown expanse of the Nevada desert. Hannah, however, wasn't looking at the target. She was looking at the numbers, at the language of the wind and the earth, preparing to speak back in the only way she knew how. Hannah was prone, a fixed point in a world of shimmering heat and nervous energy. The desert had fallen silent, the cacophony of rifle fire replaced by the whisper of the wind across the baked earth. All eyes were on her. Commander Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a monument to skepticism, his face a mask of amused disbelief. He was waiting for the anticlimax, the quiet failure that would vindicate his judgment and restore the natural order of things. He was waiting for the quiet technician to learn her place. But Hannah was in another world entirely. She closed her eyes for a single, elongated moment, shutting out the spectators, the desert, the impossible distance. Her breathing, which had been a steady, unconscious rhythm, now became a deliberate, controlled process. She drew in the hot, dry air, held it, and released it in a slow, measured sigh that seemed to carry with it all the tension on the firing line. Her finger, gloved and steady, rested on the curved steel of the trigger. It did not move. It did not anticipate. It simply was. On the tablet strapped to her wrist, a silent river of data flowed. Wind speed at 10, 50, and 100 feet. Barometric pressure, humidity, the subtle, almost imperceptible drift caused by the Earth's rotation. She didn't read the numbers in a conventional sense. She absorbed them, a complex equation solving itself in the deep, intuitive calculus of her mind. Her hand moved to the massive turret on her scope, and with a surgeon's delicacy, she made a final, tiny adjustment. A few clicks. each one a crisp, mechanical whisper that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. A quarter minute of angle for windage, an eighth for the Coriolis effect. She didn't second-guess the calculation. The problem was solved. She exhaled again, a long, slow, complete release of air, emptying her lungs until there was nothing left. And in that still, silent point at the bottom of her breath, the moment of perfect equilibrium between body and machine, she squeezed the trigger. The report of the Barrett was not a sound. It was a physical event, a concussive force that slammed into the chest of every person on the range. It was a deafening, primordial roar that momentarily silenced the desert itself. A swirling cloud of dust and sand erupted from the ground beneath the enormous muzzle brake, a miniature sandstorm born of fire and pressure. The recoil was a brutal, physical fact, a force that would have shattered the shoulder of an unprepared shooter. But Hannah was not unprepared. She became part of the rifle, her body a perfectly engineered system of shock absorption. She flowed with the immense kick, her shoulder rolling back, her frame absorbing the violence with a practiced ease that was as breathtaking as the shot itself. Her eye never left the scope, her focus unbroken. The 750-grain projectile, a finger-sized piece of machined metal, left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second, a blur of motion tearing through the superheated air. For 7.5 seconds, the world held its breath. The bullet, a tiny speck of copper and lead, began its incredible journey. It climbed on a high, majestic arc, a testament to the power that had sent it on its way. From the ground, it was invisible, a ghost in the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. It passed through layers of shifting wind, buffeted and nudged by invisible forces, yet its spin held it true. It reached the apex of its trajectory, thousands of feet in the air, and began its long final descent. The silence on the range stretched, becoming a tangible thing. 7.5 seconds felt like an eternity. Then it came. A faint, almost subliminal sound, a distant, metallic ping that echoed back across the 2 miles of empty space. It was a sound so quiet, so delicate, it felt like it could have been a trick of the wind, but it was no trick. On the giant, high-definition screen of the central monitor, the image of the distant target, a dull gray silhouette against the brown earth, suddenly changed. A brilliant, searingly bright red circle bloomed in the center of the steel torso. A perfect, undeniable, center, mass hit. For a moment, there was nothing, just the wind and the sun and the glowing red circle on the screen. The range officers, veterans of 1,000 drills, were frozen, their mouths slightly agape as they stared at the monitor. The SEALs, men who lived and breathed at the pinnacle of military professionalism, were utterly speechless, their faces a gallery of slack, jawed astonishment. The spell was broken by a trembling voice over the comms. It was the chief range officer. "Confirm," he whispered into his microphone, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Confirm. Impact." The reply came from a younger officer in the observation tower, his voice stammering. It's a hit. Center mass. First shot. Cold bore." The words hung in the air, a litany of impossibilities that had just been made real. Commander Thorne's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The arrogance, the condescending amusement, the absolute certainty of his own superiority, it all vaporized in an instant. The smirk he wore like a uniform was gone, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed vacancy. His gaze flickered from the impossible red circle on the screen to the small, quiet woman at the end of the firing line, and for the first time, he saw her not as a mechanic, but as something else entirely. Hannah was already moving. Her actions were fluid, economical, and utterly devoid of triumph. With a practiced motion that spoke of thousands of repetitions, she worked the heavy bolt of the Barrett, the mechanism sliding back with a smooth, oiled precision. The spent casing, a huge brass shell still smoking from the force of its detonation, was ejected, arcing gracefully through the air. It landed on the concrete with a single sharp tinkle, the only sound in the profound, echoing silence of the Nevada desert. The tinkling of the spent shell casing was a period at the end of a sentence no one had expected to read. The silence it left behind was heavier, more profound than before. It was a silence filled with questions, with the frantic recalibration of belief. Then, a new sound intruded, a series of sharp, electronic beeps from the main command post. On the giant monitor, the image of the target was replaced by the stark utilitarian interface of the range's automated logging system. It was designed to be an infallible, impartial record of every round fired, every hit, every miss. As the system processed the impossible event, new lines of text flashed onto the screen, stark white against a black background, for all to see. It was supposed to log the shooter's identification and weapon system. The base protocol would have dictated an entry reading something like H, Cross, Civilian Tech, Barrett M, 82A1. A simple, factual record, but that is not what appeared. Instead, a new, unauthorized entry overrode the standard protocol, its formatting stark, clinical, and utterly chilling. It was a ghost in the machine, a voice from a program that wasn't supposed to exist. Record shot, 3,400 meters. Operator id. Widow, 9. The name meant nothing to the younger SEALs. They glanced at each other, confused, assuming it was some kind of software glitch, a bizarre artifact of a system pushed beyond its designed limits. But a few of the older men on the range, the grizzled range officers and a handful of senior NCOs, men with decades of service etched into the lines on their faces, stiffened as if a jolt of electricity had passed through them. Their eyes widened, and they exchanged looks of dawning, horrified recognition. They had heard the stories, the whispers in classified debriefs, the ghost stories told over cheap whiskey about a black ops program so deep, so secret, it was officially denied before it was ever even acknowledged. Miles away, in a quiet, air-conditioned office, the base commander, General Armstrong, was monitoring the exercise on a large, wall-mounted screen. He had seen the shot, a faint puff of dust, followed by the impossible 7 and a half-second wait. He had heard the stammered confirmation of the hit and had allowed himself a small, deeply impressed smile. Then, the log appeared on his screen. He leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest, his eyes narrowing on the text. He zoomed in, his fingers tapping on a control panel, until the name filled the screen. Wido, 9. The smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by an expression of profound, world-altering shock. "My God," he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. "It's her." Hannah saw the name flash on the screen, and for the first time since she had arrived on this range, her mask of calm, impenetrable control shattered. It wasn't a gradual crumbling, it was an implosion. A wave of memory, cold and sharp as shrapnel, tore through her. The oppressive heat of the Nevada desert vanished, replaced in an instant by the biting, oxygen, starved cold of a mountain peak in the Hindu Kush. The smell of gunpowder was no longer just from her rifle. It was mixed with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of blood. The name on the screen was not an identifier, it was a brand, a title seared into her soul with loss and fire. It was a curse she thought she had outrun, a past she had tried to bury under 5 years of grease, steel, and self-imposed silence. It was the name of a ghost, her ghost. Her movements, once so unhurried and graceful, became clipped, sharp, and urgent. The desperate efficiency of a hunted animal took over. She began to pack her gear, her hands moving with a speed that bordered on frantic. The custom weather station was disconnected, the tablet shoved into its pouch, the precious rifle broken down with a series of swift, violent motions. She needed to get out. She needed to disappear back into the shadows, back into the anonymous life she had so painstakingly constructed for herself. The spotlight she had just unwillingly stepped into felt like the targeting laser of an enemy sniper. Commander Thorne saw it all. He saw the name on the screen. He saw the instantaneous, shocking transformation of the woman before him. The quiet, unassuming technician who had endured his mockery with infuriating calm was gone. In her place stood an enigma, a coiled spring of tension and buried history. A woman who could make an impossible shot look easy and whose identity was a ghost story whispered by old soldiers. The mockery he had felt just minutes ago had curdled into a toxic, chilling cocktail of humiliation and awe. He felt stripped bare, his arrogance and confidence peeled away layer by the quiet technician and her antique. He felt a sudden, primal urge to understand, to know, to bridge the impossible gap between the woman he thought he saw and the legend that had just appeared on the screen. He took a half-step toward her, his mouth opening to ask a question he didn't even know how to form. What could he possibly say? "Sorry I called your rifle a toy. Who the hell are you?" The words died on his lips, utterly useless and inadequate in the face of the impossible thing he had just witnessed. He was a commander of the most elite fighting force in the world, a man who had faced down death in a dozen countries, and yet, standing on a familiar firing range under the afternoon sun, he felt completely and utterly out of his depth. The desert wind blew, carrying the scent of gunpowder and a profound, unsettling mystery. And for the first time in his decorated career, Commander Thorne felt like a raw recruit, staring at a world he suddenly realized he knew nothing about. He watched as Hannah, her face a pale, taut mask, secured the last latch on her rifle case and turned to leave, not with the quiet deference of a civilian contractor, but with the grim, determined purpose of a soldier fleeing a battlefield she had just, against all odds, conquered. General Armstrong's office was a place where careers were made or broken with a single sentence. It was a stark, functional room, its walls adorned not with art but with framed citations, military honors, and a large, intimidatingly detailed tactical map of global hotspots. The air was cool and smelled of clean filters and authority. Commander Thorne stood at a rigid parade, ground attention before the general's imposing oak desk, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, his jaw so tight it looked like it might crack. He was a statue of mortified pride. Hannah stood a few feet away from him, her posture quiet and contained. She wasn't at attention, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, but she radiated a stillness that was somehow more formidable than Thorne's military rigidity. She looked less like a record-breaking shooter and more like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. General Armstrong, a seasoned, intelligent officer in his late 50s with eyes that missed nothing, let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, a tool he wielded with the same precision as a surgeon's scalpel. He looked from Thorne's stiff profile to Hannah's unreadable face. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, cold blade of disappointment directed squarely at the SEAL commander. "Commander," Armstrong began, "I monitored your team's performance today. It was, as expected, exemplary. I also monitored your interaction with Miss Cross." He paused, letting the weight of the word settle. "You and your men represent the absolute best of the best. The tip of the spear. That behavior, Commander, was not it. It was unprofessional, it was arrogant, and it was an embarrassment to your uniform and my command. You will formally apologize to Miss Cross. Now, am I crystal clear?" Every word was a hammer blow to Thorne's already shattered ego. A flush of hot, burning shame crept up his neck, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager. He executed a stiff, formal turn to face Hannah. Her calm, gray eyes met his, and he found he couldn't hold her gaze. He looked at a point just over her shoulder, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Miss Cross," he said, his voice a strained, formal rasp, "my conduct was unprofessional and unacceptable. I apologize." Hannah considered him for a moment, her expression unchanging. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, not an absolution. It offered him no comfort, no release from the vice of his own humiliation. The nod simply said, "I have heard your words, and nothing more." "Wait outside, Commander," Armstrong said, his tone dismissive. Thorne didn't need to be told twice. He executed another turn and walked out of the office, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft, final click. The moment the door was shut, the atmosphere in the room transformed. Armstrong's entire demeanor shifted. The stern, disciplinarian general receded, replaced by someone more calculating, more dangerous, an intelligence officer. He gestured to one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. Hannah remained standing. "Widow 9, Armstrong said, his voice now a quiet, conversational murmur. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's a ghost story, the kind of thing junior analysts whisper about when they think no one is listening. A Black Ops program so deep, so compartmentalized, it was officially denied before it was even dismantled. The rumor was, Widow 9 was a 2-person sniper team, a spotter and a shooter, the best there ever was, by a margin that terrified the people who wrote their checks." Hannah's face remained a perfect, placid mask, but her heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She felt the cold of the mountain ridge again, the ghost of a memory she fought to keep buried. "The official story, the one that doesn't exist, is that the team was compromised during an operation in the Hindu Kush," Armstrong continued, his eyes locked on hers, searching for the slightest flicker. "The spotter was killed in action. The shooter vanished, walked away, left a single, encrypted message on a secure server. Just 3 words, 'I'm done.' That was 5 years ago." Hannah remained silent. Her breathing was even, her hands still clasped behind her back. She was a statue carved from ice and secrets. "I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything, Miss Cross," Armstrong said, his voice softening slightly. "I've seen the NDA you signed. It's a document designed to erase you from history. But a problem has landed on my desk. A very serious, very unique problem. And I have a strong suspicion that the person who made that 3,400-meter shot today, the person who could make a 20-year-old rifle perform like a next-generation weapon, might be the only one on this planet who can solve it." He rose from his desk, his movements deliberate. "Walk with me." Armstrong led her from his office, not back toward the exit, but deeper into the secure facility, through a series of keycard, locked doors that opened into a sterile, white corridor. They stopped at a final door, this one made of thick, reinforced steel with a biometric scanner glowing beside it. Armstrong placed his thumb on the scanner, and the door hissed open, revealing a secure briefing room. The room was cold, the air humming with the sound of powerful ventilation. In the center of the room, resting on a black felt-covered table under a harsh direct spotlight, was a rifle. It was the most bizarre, unsettling weapon Hannah had ever seen. It looked less like a piece of manufactured hardware and more like something that had been grown or pieced together from the wreckage of a crashed alien spacecraft. The stock and chassis were made of a strange, matte black material that seemed to drink the light, a crystalline alloy that had no reflection. It was angular and brutalist in its design, yet it possessed a strange organic quality, as if it were part of a larger, unknown creature. Wires and what looked like fiber, optic filaments were embedded within the material, glowing with a faint, internal purple light. "This was recovered 2 weeks ago," Armstrong explained, his voice low and grave. "It was taken from the body of a high-value target in a very messy operation in North Africa. The target was a new player, an arms dealer selling technology that, according to our analysts, is at least 2 decades ahead of anything we currently possess, or anything we thought was possible." He gestured toward the strange weapon. "This rifle fired a projectile that could not be tracked, not by radar, not by thermal, not by any sensor system we have. It left the barrel and simply vanished from all our tracking systems. A ghost bullet. The only reason we recovered this is because the operator was eliminated by a lucky shot from a conventional weapon before he could exfiltrate." Armstrong turned to face her, his expression grim. "I need you to reverse, engineer it. I need you to figure out how it works, what it's made of, and, most importantly, how to defend against it. I'm not asking you to do this as a civilian technician, Miss Cross. I'm asking you to do this as a specialist." He slid a black access card across the table. "This will give you top secret Tier 1 clearance. You will have a dedicated lab, a support team, and a budget that will not be questioned. You will answer only to me." Hannah looked from the alien rifle to the access card, her mind reeling. This was the world she had run from, the world of secrets and shadows, of weapons that defied physics and men who sold death. "There's a catch," Armstrong added, his eyes watching her carefully. "The head of your security and logistics support will be Commander Thorne." Hannah's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with the first real emotion she had shown, a spark of indignant fire. "General," she said, her voice tight, "I'm a civilian. I fix things. I'm not an operator anymore." It was a plea, a desperate attempt to hold onto the quiet, anonymous life she had built. Armstrong's expression didn't soften. "I'm not asking you to be an operator," he countered, his voice firm. "I'm asking you to be a genius. That rifle you used out there today, the antique, my people ran its serial number. It was decommissioned 12 years ago, slated for scrap. You didn't just tune it, Miss Cross. You rebuilt it from the ground up. The trigger group is custom, the barrel harmonics have been completely re-engineered, the scope interface is a bespoke piece of brilliance that bypasses the standard mounts. It's a masterpiece of engineering and intuition. That is the mind I need. The mind that sees a weapon not just as a tool, but as a system of interconnected theories." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "As for the commander, let's just say his new assignment is a teachable moment. He needs to learn a lesson in humility. More importantly, he needs to see what real, undeniable expertise looks like. It might just make him a better officer. It will certainly make him a better man." He left the unspoken part hanging in the air, the part that said Thorne's presence was non-negotiable. Hannah looked at the crystalline rifle, at the faint, predatory glow of its internal filaments. It was a puzzle, a problem of such complexity and novelty that a part of her, the part she had tried to kill, felt an undeniable pull. It was a challenge worthy of the mind that had rebuilt the Barrett, the mind that had calculated the impossible shot. She looked at Armstrong, her gray eyes now as cold and hard as the steel of a firing pin. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached out and took the black access card from the table. The choice was made. The ghost was coming back. The laboratory was a sterile pocket of the future, a world away from the grit and heat of the desert range. The air was chilled and filtered, humming with the silent, tireless work of servers and diagnostic machines. Gleaming white surfaces and glass walls defined the space, which was dominated by holographic displays that floated in the air, filled with cascading lines of code, complex physics equations, and rotating 3D models of molecular structures. At the very center of this temple of science, resting on a sterile workbench like a profane idol, was the alien rifle. Its matte, light-absorbing alloy seemed to create a void in the brightly lit room, a patch of darkness that defied the lab's pristine order. In this sterile environment, Hannah Cross was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. She had become the ghost the system had named her, haunting the lab at all hours. An empty cot was shoved in a corner, its sheets rumpled from the few hours of sleep she allowed herself. A graveyard of empty coffee cups stood testament to her relentless pace. She worked with an obsessive, almost manic focus, a drive that went far beyond professional duty. She was not merely analyzing a weapon, she was performing an autopsy on an entirely new philosophy of ballistics, and she was doing it with the fierce intensity of a detective hunting a killer. She subjected fragments of the crystalline alloy to every test imaginable, bombarding them with radiation, analyzing their resonant frequencies, and mapping their molecular structure with an electron microscope. The holographic displays around her were a visual representation of her mind, a storm of data and theoretical models as she sought the secret held within the dark metal. Commander Thorne was a prisoner in this sterile world. His job, as defined by General Armstrong, was to facilitate. He was the head of her security, which in this isolated, top-secret lab meant he was little more than a glorified guard. He was also her logistics officer, which meant he was the one who brought her the endless cups of coffee and the bland, shrink-wrapped sandwiches she barely seemed to notice. He was a man of action, a warrior accustomed to leading from the front, and he was now relegated to the periphery, a glorified assistant to a civilian scientist. He hated it. The first few days were a torment of boredom and simmering resentment. He watched her, a coiled spring of frustration, as she moved through the lab, her focus so absolute that he doubted she even remembered his name. But as the days bled into one another, his resentment began to curdle, then slowly transform. He started to truly watch her, not as a guard watches a charge, but as a student watches a master. He saw the genius Armstrong had spoken of, not as a single act of impossible marksmanship, but as a sustained, relentless process of inquiry. He saw her test a theory, watch it fail, and then, without a flicker of frustration, recalibrate her entire model in a matter of minutes, her fingers flying across holographic keyboards. He began to see the patterns in her chaos, the deep, intuitive logic that guided her every move. The resentment faded, replaced by a grudging, then profound, respect. He started asking questions, not to challenge her or to fill the silence, but because he felt a desperate, burning need to understand. "What is that material?" he asked one evening, his voice quiet as he stood by the workbench, looking at a fragment of the alloy suspended in a magnetic field. Hannah didn't look up from a complex wave function equation she was manipulating on a display. "It's not just an alloy," she said, her voice distant, already a step ahead of his question. "It's a lattice, a programmable, resonant lattice. It seems to resonate at a specific, tunable frequency when a microcharge is applied from the firing mechanism." She made a final adjustment to the equation, and a simulated wave pattern on the display flattened into a perfect, straight line. It dampens its own thermal and kinetic signature. It fools the sensors because it's not trying to hide. It's just quiet. The air barely notices it passing through. Thorne stared at the floating piece of metal, his mind struggling to grasp the concept. A bullet that convinced the very air it wasn't there. It was a weapon built on a principle that felt more like magic than physics. He looked at Hannah, her face illuminated by the glow of the holographic data, and he understood that he was no longer just guarding a scientist. He was witnessing the birth of a new era of warfare. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from an equation or a simulation. It was from a touch. While analyzing the weapon's firing mechanism under a high-powered digital microscope, her fingers tracing the cold, alien lines of the trigger guard, she felt it, a tiny, almost invisible imperfection. She zoomed the microscope in, increasing the magnification until the image filled a wall-sized screen. There, etched into the metal with a precision that could only have been achieved by a laser, was a symbol. It was a stylized spider, its legs forming a perfect, 8-pointed star. The image hit her like a physical blow. The sterile, chilled air of the lab vanished, ripped away and replaced by the biting, razor-thin air of a mountain peak. The hum of the servers became the howl of the wind across a desolate, wind-swept ridge in the Hindu Kush. It was 5 years ago, but for Hannah, it was now. She was there. She was Widow 9, prone in the snow, the cold seeping into her bones, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Beside her, so close their shoulders were touching, was Ben. He was Widow One, her spotter, her partner, her other half. They were a seamless unit, a two-person weapon system that had become a legend in the shadows. Their dialogue was a clipped, efficient shorthand born of 1,000 hours spent in just such a place. "Wind shift, 2 knots, from the west," Ben murmured, his eye never leaving the spotting scope. "Target is on the move. He's nervous." "I see him," Hannah whispered back, her own eye pressed to the scope of her rifle, a highly modified M110. The target, a warlord turned arms dealer, was a kilometer away, a small figure pacing on a balcony. On the sleeve of his jacket was an embroidered patch, a stylized spider. "They have new tech," Ben said, his voice tight with concern. "Something's not right. The thermals are clean. Too clean." Before Hannah could process his words, the world dissolved into chaos. There was no sound, no warning, just a sudden, violent pressure wave that threw her sideways. Ben had moved with impossible speed, his body a shield, pushing her off her position just as their hide was engulfed in a silent, searingly bright explosion. He took the full force of the blast from an experimental drone, a silent, fast-moving killer that had appeared from nowhere. He was thrown against the rocks, his body broken. Hannah scrambled to him, the world a blur of pain, guilt, and the roaring in her ears. His last word was not a call for help, not a curse, but a single, desperate whisper of her name. "Hannah!" It was the sound of her world ending. This was the moment she became a widow. This was the memory she had run from, the ghost that haunted her every waking moment. She gasped, her eyes flying open, the sterile white of the lab flooding back into her vision. She was shaking, her hand still resting on the alien rifle, her skin cold and clammy. The spider symbol on the screen seemed to mock her, a ghost from a past that refused to stay buried. The mission, she now realized, was not just a technical problem. It was a reckoning, shaken but resolute, the memory acting not as an anchor but as a whetstone. Hannah returned to the weapon with a terrifying new intensity. The spider symbol was the key, the missing variable in her equation. It wasn't just a maker's mark, it was a signature. The same people who had built the drone that killed Ben had built this rifle. Her grief, a cold, hard stone in her chest for 5 years, now began to burn, transmuting into a cold, clear rage. She looked at the rifle, not as a weapon, but as a message. The ghost bullet, the silent projectile, it was too elegant, too subtle for a simple assassination. It was a diversion. Her mind raced, connecting the dots, the disparate pieces of data from her analysis clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. The crystalline alloy, the resonant frequency, the way it quieted the projectile's signature. It wasn't about stealth, it was about delivery. She pulled up a new set of simulations, her fingers a blur across the holographic interface. She modeled the projectile not as a kinetic object, but as a carrier. The resonant frequency of the alloy, she theorized, didn't just dampen its signature. It created a localized distortion in space-time, a micro-wormhole, stable for only a nanosecond upon impact. It wasn't delivering a payload of explosives, it was delivering a payload of data. The ghost bullet wasn't the weapon, it was the most sophisticated data injection system ever conceived. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The mission in the Hindu Kush, the one that had cost Ben his life, hadn't been a failure because they were ambushed. It had been a success for the enemy. The target on the balcony hadn't been the real objective. He was the shooter. He had fired his own ghost bullet, not at a person, but at the secure communications array of the forward operating base. He had shot the network, injecting a dormant virus directly into the heart of the military's most secure systems. The enemy wasn't just selling weapons, they were selling a key that could unlock any digital door on the planet, a way to bypass any firewall, any encryption, any security measure. A cold dread, far deeper and more terrifying than the memory of the ambush, washed over her. The virus had been sleeping for 5 years, but she had just been given access to the very systems it was designed to attack. Her activation, her very presence here, might be the trigger to wake it up. She slammed a hand down on the lab's emergency comms panel, her voice sharp, urgent, and stripped of all its previous calm. "Get me General Armstrong and Commander Thorne, now." A moment later, their faces appeared on the main screen. "What is it, Miss Cross?" Armstrong asked, his expression concerned. Hannah looked from the General's face to Thorne's, her own face pale, her eyes burning with a terrible certainty. "General," she said, her voice low and steady, a harbinger of the coming storm. "We have a much bigger problem. They didn't fail 5 years ago. They succeeded. They're not coming for us. They're already inside." Hannah's words hung in the secure comms channel, colder and heavier than any steel door. Before Armstrong could even formulate a response, as if her voice were the trigger, the world went mad. A piercing, cacophonous alarm blared through the command center, a sound designed to signal a catastrophic failure. On the main tactical displays, screens that moments before had shown orderly base schematics dissolved into a cascade of crimson error messages and corrupted data streams. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into strobing chaos, before emergency power kicked in with a heavy thrum, casting everything in a sickly, yellow, auxiliary glow. Cyber warfare technicians, the best the Air Force had to offer, scrambled over their consoles, their faces pale with shock and confusion. They were pilots flying blind in a hurricane, their controls unresponsive, their instruments screaming gibberish. The virus was a monster, a digital leviathan that had been sleeping in the deep, and now it was awake and tearing their world apart. It moved with a predatory intelligence, not just disabling systems but actively turning them against each other. Automated defense turrets swiveled aimlessly, their targeting systems fried. Communications arrays began broadcasting deafening static across all channels. The base's digital nervous system was having a grand mal seizure. "What am I looking at?" Armstrong demanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the rising panic. "It's everywhere, sir," a young lieutenant stammered, his fingers flying uselessly over a keyboard. "It's rewriting its own source code as we try to isolate it. It's not just a virus, it's an ecosystem. We can't get a handle on it." In the sterile quiet of her lab, Hannah watched a single, secure monitor displaying a diagnostic of the attack's architecture. She was an island of calm in the raging storm. While the technicians in the command center saw chaos, she saw purpose. She saw the logic, the philosophy of the weapon she had spent days dissecting. The attack was brutal and overwhelming, but it was also elegant, a masterpiece of misdirection. It was loud, it was flashy, and it was designed to draw every eye. "General," she said, her voice cutting through the comms, clear and steady, "ignore the virus. It's a diversion. It's a magic trick, the grand gesture to distract the audience." "What are you talking about, Miss Cross?" Armstrong shot back, his patience worn thin. "My base is being digitally disemboweled." "It's designed to make you look at the screens," Hannah explained, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "It's a wall of noise and fire to cover a quiet entry. The real threat isn't in the code, it's on foot. They're coming for this lab. They need to erase their creation, and the one person who understands it. Lock down the physical perimeter, Sector 4. Now, they're already on the grounds." There was a beat of silence on the other end. The only sounds, the frantic shouting and blaring alarms of the command center. Armstrong was being asked to trust a ghost story over the complete digital collapse of his multi-billion-dollar facility. He looked at the screaming red screens, then his mind flashed to the impossible red circle on the target 2 miles away. He made his choice. "You heard her," Armstrong roared into his own comm channel, his voice shaking the room. "Seal the perimeter around the R&D labs. Sector 4. All available combat personnel. Respond. This is not a drill. We have an active infiltration." Just as the general's orders echoed across the base, Hannah's prediction became a terrifying reality. In the chaos of the cyber attack, with automated sensors either disabled or spewing nonsensical data, a small, highly trained team of enemy operatives breached the outer fence. They moved like wraiths through the desert night, their forms barely disturbing the air. They were equipped with the same ghost technology as the rifle, their combat suits woven with a variant of the resonant alloy lattice. They didn't just mask their heat signatures, they actively dampened their kinetic and thermal presence, making them all but invisible to the base's remaining. And now frantically searching. Sensors. They were phantoms, moving through the shadows with a lethal purpose that was as silent as their footfalls. The only unit close enough to respond was Commander Thorne's. The SEALs, caught flat, footed by the sudden shift from a training exercise to a full-blown siege, scrambled to arm themselves with live ammunition. This was no longer a drill. This was their home turf, their fortress, and it had been breached by an enemy using tactics and technology that were, until an hour ago, purely theoretical. Thorne, his face a grim mask of determination, led his small team of 4 operators into the night, their high-tech gear suddenly feeling heavy and obsolete. "Eyes up," Thorne barked into his team's comms. "We're fighting ghosts. Standard thermals are useless. Watch for movement, for anything that doesn't feel right." They were moving blind, hunting an enemy they couldn't see. The first engagement was a brutal, shocking lesson. 2 of Thorne's men went down without a sound, their bodies slumping to the ground before anyone even heard a shot. The enemy's weapons were as silent as their movements. Thorne and his remaining 2 men dove for cover behind a concrete blast barrier, their hearts pounding, their confidence shattered. They were the hunters, the apex predators, and they were being picked apart like amateurs. "I can't see them," one of his men, a young operator named Diaz, hissed, his eyes scanning the darkness frantically. "Where are they?" Then, a new voice entered their comms, a voice that was calm, clear, and utterly authoritative. It was Hannah. "Commander, I'm locked in the lab, but I have access to the facility's high-resolution gravimetric and atmospheric scanners," she said, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. "Your standard sensors are useless, but they can't hide from physics. Their gear displaces air and mass. It creates micro-distortions. I can see them." Thorne's breath caught in his throat. She was his overwatch. A civilian technician locked in a lab was about to become the eyes of a SEAL team in a firefight. "Talk to me, Hannah," he said, the name slipping out naturally. The formality of Miss Cross burned away by the urgency of the moment. 2 hostiles, moving along the north wall of Hangar 3, 20 meters from your position, her voice directed, calm and precise. "They're using the heat wash from the HVAC units to mask the faint signature their suits still leak. You have a flanking route from the west, along that service conduit. The distortion from the pipe will cover your approach. Go now." There was no hesitation. The man who had mocked her, who had dismissed her, now placed the lives of his men and himself entirely in her hands. "Diaz, with me," Thorne commanded. "Riley, cover us." He trusted her, without question, without a flicker of doubt. He led Diaz on the route she had laid out, their movements swift and silent. They moved along the conduit, just as she'd said, and as they rounded the corner, they saw them. They weren't visible as people, but as faint, man-shaped shimmers in the air, like heat haze on a summer road. It was a sight that would haunt Thorne's dreams for years. He and Diaz opened fire, their rifles chattering, spitting tracers that illuminated the night. The shimmering shapes recoiled, their silent weapons firing back, the air around the SEALs cracking with the passage of supersonic rounds. But Thorne and Diaz had the advantage of surprise, an advantage bought for them by Hannah's mind. One of the shimmering forms collapsed, its cloaking effect failing in a shower of purple sparks, revealing a man in a sleek, black combat suit. The second hostile returned fire, pinning them down, before melting back into the shadows. "He's falling back," Thorne relayed, his voice tight. "Toward the lab." "I see him," Hannah replied instantly. "He's trying to link up with his leader. They're making a final push." The cat and mouse game was a brutal, terrifying dance in the dark. Thorne and his 2 men moved through the facility, guided by Hannah's voice. She was their oracle, seeing the unseen, predicting the enemy's movements with uncanny accuracy. She directed them through ambushes, warned them of flanking maneuvers, and guided their fire onto targets that were little more than whispers in the fabric of reality. Thorne's years of training, his combat instincts, his team's flawless execution, it was all a potent force, but it was being guided by a level of intelligence he had never encountered. It was a deadly, perfect combination of brawn and brain, of the warrior and the genius. Thorne's team successfully neutralized the second hostile and 1 other, but the cost was high. Riley was badly wounded, and they were running low on ammunition. The enemy leader, a larger, faster shimmer in the darkness, and his 2 remaining operatives had used the firefights as cover to advance. They were now cornered, their objective just meters away, and that made them more dangerous than ever. They had reached the corridor leading directly to Hannah's lab. Thorne and Diaz took up a position at the end of the long, sterile white hallway, using a service alcove as cover. They could see the 3 distortions at the far end, huddled by the reinforced steel door of the lab. The power dynamic had completely, irrevocably inverted. Thorne, the arrogant commander, was now a soldier on the line, completely reliant on the voice in his ear. He was trusting her not just with the mission, but with his life and the lives of his men. In her calm, precise instructions, he heard not just a brilliant analyst, but the cool, unflappable confidence of an operator. He saw the ghost, the strategist she had always been, hidden beneath the quiet facade of a civilian technician. "They're setting a charge," Diaz whispered, his voice tight with dread. Thorne saw it too. The enemy leader, the largest of the 3 shimmers, was placing a block of explosives on the lab door. A small red light began to blink, a countdown to 0. "Hannah, they're breaching," Thorne said into his comm, his voice grim. "We're pinned down. We don't have a clear shot." The enemy operatives had them locked down, their silent rifles spitting rounds that chipped away at the concrete around their position, forcing them to stay deep in cover. They were trapped. The red light on the breaching charge blinked faster. 5 seconds. 4, 3. Inside the lab, Hannah heard Thorne's warning. She looked at the main screen, which showed a tactical view of the corridor, the red icons of Thorne and Diaz pinned down, the blinking icon of the breaching charge on her door. She looked at the disassembled alien rifle on her workbench, a puzzle she had solved too late. Then, her gaze shifted to the corner of the lab. There, leaning against the wall, was a long, heavy, familiar case, the case she had carried onto the range, the case containing the rifle they had all dismissed as an antique. With a calm, deliberate motion, she walked toward it, her face a mask of cold, resolute purpose. The charge was about to blow, the ghosts were at her door, and Widow, 9, was about to wake up. The breaching charge detonated with a deafening metallic shriek, a sound of tortured steel giving way. The reinforced lab door, designed to withstand a rocket-propelled grenade, buckled inwards as if kicked by a giant, its locks and hinges shearing off in a shower of white-hot sparks. It flew across the room, a 2-ton slab of metal, and crashed into a bank of servers, which exploded in a fountain of electronics and shattered glass. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke and pulverized concrete billowed into the corridor, momentarily obscuring everything. The enemy leader, a shimmering distortion of a man, stormed through the breach, his movements fluid and predatory. He expected to find a terrified scientist cowering behind a workbench. He expected an easy kill, the final loose end of a 5-year-old operation. Instead, he found Hannah Cross. She was standing in the exact center of the ruined laboratory, a figure of impossible calm amidst the chaos. She wasn't wearing armor, just her soot, stained lab coat over her practical cargo pants. But in her hands, she held the massive, antiquated form of the Barrett M82A1, its muzzle leveled directly at the doorway. Her eyes, visible through the swirling smoke, were not the eyes of a scientist or a victim. They were chips of cold, gray steel. They were the eyes of a killer. "Commander," she said, her voice perfectly calm and clear over the private comm channel she had established with Thorne. "On my mark, you and Diaz are to suppress the 2 hostiles on the flanks. Do not engage the leader. Ignore him completely. He's mine." "Hannah, don't." Thorne's voice shot back, laced with panic. "You're not wearing armor. That's a suicide mission. Get down." "Just trust me, Commander," she replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. It was not a request, it was an order. The enemy leader raised his ghost rifle, the strange crystalline alloy seeming to drink the chaotic light of the ruined lab. He was faster, his weapon a marvel of next-generation technology. But Hannah was not playing his game. She didn't aim for his head or his chest. The center, mass targets drilled into every soldier. Her mind, a supercomputer of ballistics and physics, saw a different target, a different weakness. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, its thunderous report a defiant, analog cry against the silent lethality of the enemy. The .50 caliber round, a heavy piece of machined metal, crossed the 10 meters of the lab in a fraction of a second. It did not strike the man. It struck his weapon. The round slammed directly into the central resonant chamber of the crystalline rifle. For a nanosecond, nothing happened. Then, the energy feedback loop Hannah had theorized about, the catastrophic weakness she had discovered, became a violent reality. The massive kinetic energy of the .50 caliber round, instead of being absorbed or deflected, was instantly channeled into the rifle's power source. The weapon, designed to handle microcharges, was suddenly inundated with a tidal wave of raw, uncontrollable energy. The crystalline lattice overloaded. It glowed a brilliant, blinding purple, then white, and then, with a soundless, concussive flash, it detonated. The ghost rifle exploded with the force of a half-dozen grenades, taking its wielder with it in a blast of pure, destructive energy. Simultaneously, following Hannah's orders to the letter, Thorne and Diaz opened fire on the 2 remaining hostiles. Blinded and disoriented by the unexpected explosion from their leader, the enemy operatives were easy targets. Thorne and Diaz stitched them with controlled bursts, their shimmering forms collapsing to the ground, their cloaking technology failing in death. Silence fell, absolute and profound. The alarms had been silenced by the blast. The gunfire had ceased. The only sound was the gentle hiss of a severed coolant pipe and the faint crackle of burning electronics. The thick smoke began to clear, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Hannah stood unmoving in the center of it all, the barrel of her Barrett still smoking, a pillar of calm in the wreckage she had wrought. She had not just killed the enemy. She had defeated his technology. She had used a relic to turn his greatest strength into his own destruction. It was the ultimate, brutal, and beautiful vindication. General Armstrong was the first to arrive, his face a grim mask as he and a team of armed security personnel swept into the ruined laboratory. He took in the scene, the dead operatives, the smoking crater where the enemy leader had stood, and the quiet woman standing in the middle of it all. His grim expression slowly melted away, replaced by one of profound, unadulterated respect. Thorne was right behind him, his rifle held at the low ready. He approached Hannah slowly, his steps uncertain on the debris-strewn floor. The arrogance, the swagger, the condescending smirk, it was all gone, burned away, and replaced by a look of pure awe. He looked at her, then at the smoking barrel of the Barrett, then at the unrecognizable, molten wreckage of the ghost rifle. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. You used his own weapon against him. You made it explode." Hannah's shoulders slumped slightly, the immense adrenaline of the fight finally beginning to fade. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer now, tinged with an exhaustion that went bone deep. "Every weapon has a weakness, Commander," she said, her gaze distant. "You just have to know where to look." She looked down at the Barrett in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar, worn steel. Then she looked at the wreckage of the alien technology. It was a symbolic tableau, the old and the new, the past and the present, the brutal simplicity of kinetic energy versus the fragile complexity of advanced physics. She had proven that the mind behind the weapon was always more important than the weapon itself. Thorne simply stared, his world remade. He had mocked this woman, dismissed her as a tinkerer playing with a museum piece, and she had just saved his life, his base, and perhaps much more, with that same museum piece and a mind that saw the universe in a way he could barely comprehend. A week later, Hannah was once again standing in General Armstrong's office. The room was the same, but the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no tension, no unspoken judgment. Commander Thorne was there too, standing not at stiff attention, but in a relaxed posture near the window, a silent participant in the meeting. "The debriefs are complete," Armstrong began, his voice laced with a gravity that went beyond military formality. "The data you recovered from the wreckage, combined with your analysis, has sent a shockwave through the entire intelligence community. The virus they planted 5 years ago has been isolated and neutralized, thanks to you. You single-handedly neutralized a threat that could have crippled global security for the next decade." He leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. "The President has been briefed. The Joint Chiefs are calling what you did the single most important act of counter-terrorism in the last 20 years. Hannah said nothing, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression neutral. Armstrong continued, "Which brings us to the future, your future." He slid a thin, black folder across the desk. "I have been authorized to make you an offer. We don't want you to rejoin the military. We want you to lead. We are creating a new, independent division, funded by a black budget, that will answer to no one but this office. Its sole purpose will be to anticipate and counter next-generation threats, to bridge the gap between civilian research and development and special operations. We're calling it Project Widow." He let the name hang in the air. "You will have full autonomy, a starting budget of $100 million. You will have your own hand-picked team. You will have the authority to requisition any personnel or technology you deem necessary. We need that mind, Hannah. We need you to see what's coming before anyone else does." "You can't be a ghost forever, Hannah," Armstrong said, his voice softening. "You tried that. It didn't work. The world needs you. Not the operator you were, but the leader you are now." Hannah thought about her past, about the cold mountain ridge, about Ben's last word. She thought about the quiet, anonymous life she had tried so desperately to build, a life of grease and steel and solitude. She realized she couldn't run from who she was, the part of her that saw the world as a series of complex, interconnected systems, the part that could calculate an impossible shot. That part would never truly be silent, but she could redefine its purpose. She could use it not just to end threats, but to prevent them. "I'll do it," she said, her voice clear and firm. "On one condition." "Name it," Armstrong said without hesitation. Hannah's gaze shifted to the man standing by the window. "My first recruit is Commander Thorne. He still has a lot to learn." A slow smile spread across General Armstrong's lips. He looked at Thorne, who met his gaze with a look of humbled, resolute acceptance. "I think that can be arranged," the general said. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange, purple, and red. The firing range was empty now, silent save for the gentle whisper of the evening breeze. Hannah stood on the firing line, not as a technician or a soldier, but as something new. She looked out towards the distant mountains, their peaks sharp against the vibrant sky. Thorne walked up and stood beside her. He was no longer her guard, no longer her logistics officer. He was her partner. They stood in a comfortable, easy silence for a long moment, watching the day die. "Widow 9, Thorne said finally, his voice quiet, the question gentle. "Is that who you are?" Hannah continued to look at the horizon, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a smile that reached her eyes, warming their cool, grey depths. "It's a part of who I am," she said after a long pause, "a part I'll always carry. But it's not the whole story. Not anymore." She turned and walked away from the firing line, away from the place of her rebirth, leaving the ghosts of the past behind her as she stepped into the long shadows of the future. Thorne watched her for a second, a look of profound respect on his face. Then he turned and followed her, a warrior ready to learn from his new commander. The story of the quiet technician was over. The story of Project Widow was just beginning.